From Pod News, welcome to Podland, the last word in podcasting news. It's Thursday the 29th of September 2022. I'm James Cridland, the editor of Pod News.
And I'm Sam Sethi, the managing director of River Radio.
Hi, it's Morten Strunge from Podimo, and I'm here today to talk about subscription for podcasting and the journey that Podimo has been on, and I look forward to embark upon in the future as well.
And this is John Spurlock, and I'll be on later to talk about OP3, the Open Podcast Prefix project.
They will. Podland is sponsored by Squadcast. We use the latest Squadcast version 5 to remotely record this episode. I'm in Australia, Sam's in the UK.
And we're sponsored and hosted by Buzzsprout. Last week, 3,568 people started a podcast with Buzzsprout, and now there's Buzzsprout ads to grow your podcast wherever it's hosted. Buzzsprout has recently added control of mid-roll settings as well as a new feature for Buzzsprout ads.
Podland is where Sam and I review the week's top podcasting stories covered on Pod News.
We support both transcripts and chapters, and if your podcast app doesn't, then grab a new podcast app from podnews.net/new podcast apps.
So what's the top story this week then, Sam?
So, when I put a little reveal behind the curtain for everybody, when we start to put the stories together, James, for our script, and I go through Pod News and I'm looking around, and then the top story wasn't going to be the one we started with, and then boom, Ashley Carman drops the big potato down on everybody with a brilliant reveal in Bloomberg, where she talks about podcast companies are buying millions of listens through autoplay episodes populated in free mobile games. She went on to say, iHeart, the top podcast publisher on Podtrac, has bought around 6 million unique downloads per month since 2018, and these count as an IAB download. Now that, James, was the big story everywhere. So I'm going to now ask you to give me a little bit more about whether this was a good thing that iHeart and Podtrac are doing, or is this a bit dodgy?
There's a question. So what they're basically doing is if you play any online game, then you'll know that there's usually the opportunity for you to watch an ad, and in return you get, 1,000 credits, or you get a free life, or you get something or else. And that's basically how many of these mobile games make their money. In this particular case, players got game tokens if they listened to a podcast for just 20 seconds. And there was a little clip of a particular podcast that's run by iHeart that was, available in one of these games. And that's all fine. Except when you listen to a podcast for just 20 seconds, then the mobile game app is downloading enough audio for over 60 seconds. And over 60 seconds worth of audio means it's a IAB certified download. And it means that iHeart, in that particular case, can both charge for the ads delivered in the show, because it's a proper real download, isn't it? Because it's more than 60 seconds of audio. And it also means that Podtrac will count those in the rankers as well. So it's an interesting bit of data manipulation, I guess, in many ways.
I think you said something brilliantly on Twitter. You said, if you buy those in-game ads for $5 for the CPM, sell 2 ads in the podcast for $25 CPM, you can make $45 CPM profit and appear higher in the rankings. You said it was genius, and I think that was sarcasm, just in case anyone missed the tone. But that's, in a summary, what they're doing. They're basically manipulating the numbers and increasing their profits. Clearly, this has to be something that should stop, or at least, does that make rankers irrelevant then? Or does that just mean iHeart's rank is just not true? And where would they rank?
Well, there's an interesting question. So I firstly went to check whether or not this would actually trigger the Podtrac redirect, so that it would actually count for the Podtrac ranker. And the answer is yes. Yes, it does. So the second thing is I asked Podtrac, and Podtrac say, well, we have been aware of this sort of thing. We decided not to filter these downloads because they're consistent with the latest IAB guidelines. And they also go on to say that they don't have a material impact on the publisher rankings, including the rank order of the top publishers. Well, they might not have a material impact on the rankings, but I bet they have a material impact on the numbers. 6 million unique downloads downloads per month since 2018. That's an awful lot of, frankly, fake podcast listens. And they clearly are fake, because 20 seconds worth of audio played is not a 45-minute or 1 hour long podcast. And you certainly wouldn't hear all of the ads. You don't even hear all of the pre-roll ad, let alone everything else. So is it fraudulent? Yes, I think if I was an advertiser in these podcasts, I would be asking for my money back from iHeart. And, we haven't heard any advertisers doing that quite as yet, but you can well see that would be a thing that they wouldn't necessarily be particularly happy about.
No, now the ad company in question is Dupe, and they can't clearly only have iHeart as a client. They must have other clients who are podcasters, and clearly they aren't the only agency involved. So how big do you think this might be? I mean, is it, other companies, iHeart's been mentioned, but are they the only ones who are doing this? Or
well, there are 3 companies so far which have been mentioned. There's iHeart. Then, amusingly enough, there's Bloomberg, whose podcasts have appeared in these things, but actually Bloomberg distributes and monetizes its shows using iHeart, so it's really just iHeart under a different brand. And then there's one more, which is the New York Post, and the New York Post is completely different, isn't in any rankers, and monetizes through Megaphone. So it's not just iHeart, that is certainly fair, but iHeart they've got a pretty rich history in terms of gaming some of the charts, you could argue. In 2018, I discovered that iHeartMedia was embedding podcasts on radio station websites, which led to very significantly inflated play counts. They managed to even get Podtrac to launch a brand new podcast chart, which was a short-form podcast chart, specifically so that they could be in the lead of one of these charts back then. So that's they've certainly done, but they're also doing other things. They appear to have very recently added a bunch of additional shows from iHeart's Spreaker platform, so that they can probably measure those iHeart numbers on Podtrac using Spreaker. 2,000 additional shows added, or rather 2,000 additional episodes added over the last month. So iHeart does appear to be doing some strange things in terms of making sure that they are number one of that Podtrac chart. I think what really confuses me about it is that there is another ranker, of course, in the US. It's a ranker that works on log files rather than on prefixes. It's run by Triton. Triton is owned by iHeartMedia, but iHeartMedia don't use Triton to measure their own podcasts. Why is that then? Is there something going on here where Triton don't necessarily want to point out that iHeart isn't quite as big as they are? Is there a conflict here between Triton measuring their numbers and finding out that quite a few of their numbers are just fraudulent as these ones are? Or, is there something else going on? I find the whole thing fascinating, and it's just very strange that it's iHeart, number one for podcasts, which is forever doing weird and wonderful things with podcast numbers. And it's just, to me, it's just a little bit suspicious.
Now, a few people have jumped in as well, James. Rob Greenleaf from Libsyn said, not exactly the most ethical or honest practice for those selling download impressions to advertisers. Could be seen as fraud, actually. This is sad to see. Buying faked downloads has been an edge case practice by some for many years, but most hosts can detect it and filter out those and fake bot downloads as well. So if it's detectable, and Podtrac are choosing not to do it, are they complicit?
I'm not sure that I have necessarily the answer to that. I mean, they are saying that these numbers are consistent and these downloads are consistent with the latest IAB guidelines. And so is the IAB complicit in this? Podtrac are doing things by the letter according to the IAB, so Podtrac say. So is it the IAB that has basically said, well, that's all okay then, isn't it? Todd Cochran says that this is why podcast measurement platforms have to have robust fraud protection for this. We've seen it all since 2006, and Blueberry, of course, runs its own prefix service. And I think, one of the difficulties here is, it looks like a browser. It doesn't have a unique user agent. It doesn't have the user agent of the app because it's just a web view within the app itself, and so therefore it's actually a little bit harder to spot anyway. But even if you were going to spot it, again, they're consistent with the IAB guidelines. Apparently, it's absolutely fine if somebody plays 20 seconds worth of a 45-minute podcast, but their system downloads 5 minutes of it. Apparently, that's a full download of the 45 minutes. It's mind-boggling, to be honest.
Well, Adam Curry has long held a view around this, and he is sitting there rubbing his hands going, "Told you so." Podcasters are buying millions of listens with mobile ads. The podcast industrial complex, as he calls it, is crumbling. Of course, Adam is very favoured in value for value and the idea of payment through Satoshis and no advertising needed, therefore. So, yes, he's very happy.
I think on the other side, people buy advertising because advertising works for them. It's not a charity. They're not just buying into a particular show because they like that particular show. They're buying a particular show so that people hear the adverts and people go out and buy their stuff. That's what advertising is all about. Now, advertising isn't going to work if nobody listens to the ad. And in this particular case, people are, let's not beat around the bush, people are being charged for buying advertising in a podcast that no one is listening to. And that is clearly not going to work financially, but it's not going to work, ethically for that particular advertiser, because that advertiser is going to turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, I've spent $10,000. Not one person has heard that particular ad. I'd like my $10,000 back.
Nick Hilton said it quite interestingly. This is a very strange form of marketing where the purpose is not to generate new listeners, something that digital marketers are usually desperate to do, but to simply game the algorithms that govern podcast discoverability. If you can add 1 million plays to your podcast through this weird in-game mechanic, you're going to find yourself at the top of the Apple and Spotify charts. That's a position that money can't buy. Well, clearly it is a position that money can buy because they've done it.
Yes, to a degree, but it's not going to actually change the Apple and Spotify podcast charts, which are both based on the amount of people that follow that particular show within those apps and the amount of plays within those apps that actually happen. So they're not going to appear in the top of Apple and Spotify podcast charts, but in terms of PodTrack or in terms of similar podcast prefix analytics, they will absolutely have an effect. Now, they may not have an effect of the rank order of the top publishers, as PodTrack tell me, but nevertheless, they're still going to have an effect on the numbers. And I think that that's an important side of it. Buying an ad in a game is absolutely fine. It's an absolutely, successful thing to do. Lots of people do it. It seems to work very, very well. But it's the way that the IAB guidelines have been taken advantage of here, which has really caused the issues, I think.
So in summary, is the solution that the IAB guidelines need to be updated? And what does that constitute? How long is long enough then to qualify as a listen?
I think there are two things. Firstly, are prefix tools like PodTrack and other prefix tools which exist out there, and we'll go on and talk about other prefix tools in a little bit, but are these prefix tools not worth anything because, you're not actually measuring anything more than a signpost to a file? But more than that, are download numbers by themselves actually helpful at all? Maybe this is playing into Spotify's hands because only Spotify is actually selling on actual play numbers, on where people play, how long people have a listen. And all of that information is only available in Spotify because it's a closed garden, because Spotify control the player as well as controlling, the advertising and everything else in there as well. So I think what worries me about this is that this is playing into the hands of those people who think that the open podcast ecosystem is a bad idea. We should be getting rid of the open podcast ecosystem because the data is so flaky. And now we're actually seeing podcast companies who are, whether they're doing this on purpose or not, flouting the theory behind those IAB rules, ending up with this bizarre situation where 20 seconds worth of podcast listened to is equal to a full 45-minute podcast being downloaded, and they're charging advertising based on that. So if we're not very careful, we'll end up with Spotify and YouTube jumping in and saying, well, we can fix all of this for you, and the rest of the open podcast ecosystem being damaged as a result.
Well, we'll have a little bit more in the show about maybe how that can be addressed. Now, moving swiftly on. Another thing that I saw was a small little article from Omni Studio that you had in Pod News. It was how many downloads per episode is good. And I thought that was quite interesting because they've taken some data and they've updated it from last year. So this was from June 2022. And they looked at how many downloads per episode is good, as I said, in the last 30 days. It seems that if you've got 87 downloads in the first 30 days, you get into the top 50%. Some really interesting data about what categories work and which countries as well. Did you have a look at it, James?
Yeah, it's a good piece of data. I think it's from Sharon Taylor. She calls herself I all the way through, but never actually tells us who it is. But right. I think it is Sharon's data, and it's very interesting. They say that the top 1% of podcasts have 50,000 downloads in the first 30 days, which seems a remarkably round number. The top 2% has 21,334. Interesting also to compare them with our sponsor Buzzsprout, because Buzzsprout published the same numbers as well, in this case for the first 7 days rather than for the first 30 days. You'll find those at buzzsprout.com/global_stats. And I think what's always fascinating here is seeing how those numbers differ. Buzzsprout's numbers are rather a lot smaller, but that may be because Omni Studio is an enterprise podcast host. You pay an awful lot of money to be in there, and typically you have very large podcast publishers in there. And also, secondly, of course, Buzzsprout's numbers may be slightly skewed by the fact that they have a free tier in there as well, so people are jumping in but maybe not promoting them as hard as you would if you want to get your money back.
Yeah, again, look, it's all about downloads, right? So you can see why companies like iHeartMedia want their download numbers to be higher, puts them in different brackets for advertisers. Is there a way that the industry should I'm being very naive here because again, I've asked this question before, and I'm sure you've told me no is the answer. But should we move to a non-download model? I mean, Spotify is a non-download model. I say it's streaming, and then everyone goes, no, it's not actually streaming. And then I go, I don't understand. But I go, okay, and nod my head profusely.
So the difference between Spotify and any other podcast platform out there is that Spotify both sells advertising, but also is in control of the podcast platform itself and is a large podcast platform. So they can actually see when somebody presses the play button, when somebody skips, when somebody stops, which you can't necessarily see on other platforms. Apple Podcasts gives you some of that information, but obviously Apple aren't actually selling, any advertising. So Spotify is a bit different. Now, there was an attempt 3 or 4 years ago from NPR to do exactly that, to build something that they called RAD. Can't quite remember what RAD stood for, but it was basically a way of signaling back from any podcast app when someone pressed play, when someone paused it, when someone skipped. so that you would actually have playback statistics back to any podcast host. And that was a good piece of open data, which the Privacy Brigade jumped up and down at and were terribly upset about. From the other side, it was very difficult to actually get any podcast apps to support that because they saw that as spying on their audience. But, RAD would have done exactly the same thing. But I think after a year's worth of quite bruising conversations that NPR were having with other people, they kind of gave it up as a bad idea, and nobody else has touched it because of that whole, experience. Maybe this might bring that idea back again. Who knows? Now,
let's move on to some other stories. I've been fascinated by a company called Podimo, based out of Denmark, for a while now. Every time I see a story on Pod News, I go, I don't know these guys. I don't know what they do. It's not on my radar. And yet they've raised recently 58.6 million euros, which in current currency is practically $58.6 million because it's pound for pound and euro for euro nearly.
And
but
well done on that, by the way.
Yes. And they previously raised more than $116 million. These numbers are massive in any startup that's only 3 years old. What do you think of Podimo? I mean, you've written about them a few times in the past, James.
Yeah, I think they're really interesting. I mean, they've been acquiring a lot of stuff. They acquired the largest podcast publisher in the Netherlands, for example, Dag en Nacht, which has over 60 shows. And they acquired them back in March. In August, they launched in Finland with a number of exclusive shows in there as well. They do seem to be doing really well. And they've not been going for particularly long as well. So you ended up having a chat with their CEO, didn't you?
Yeah, I thought I'd reach out to Morten Strunger, and ask him, A, who are Podimo, B, how have they raised all this money, and C, what's their strategy going forward?
I think there's two fundamental things that we're really betting big on and investing into. One is that we have the benefit of having a pure focus on podcasting as the only thing, which means that if you look at our app and the product experience we're able to build around podcasting and spoken word audio, it just serves a different way of discovering content, engaging with content, and so forth. So having this vertical focus, as we call it, from a product and tech perspective, really allows us to build out a different experience, a unique experience. And then on the other side, it's our investment into the creator community. So we do invest heavily into being a part of the creator community and helping creators monetize through our version, which is subscription. And that really benefits the creator communities, and a lot of new creators outside audio are also beginning to create audio content as well, which again benefits our users and drives a lot of user growth to our platform. So it's the ecosystem on one side, having the focus on subscription as we do. And then on the other side, it is very much the product focus, which is what we're thriving on.
I mean, that's quite a strong bet. Local first, subscription based. Was that your pitch to the investors? We're going to do yin while everyone's going yang. We're going to go to this totally new, unfettered space where there's no competition, and we're going to go into this market and own it before anyone else comes and joins.
I have a background in subscription, so I'm a firm believer that, like in any content industry, there will be a mix of subscription and advertising-based models. Not that we don't believe in advertising. We believe strongly in advertising, and it will be a very significant part of podcasting in the future as well. But we do feel that there is lacking, or was lacking, a subscription version as well, which some creators benefit from, and some creators benefit from advertising, right? So it has been a core part of our pitch since we launched. And obviously, when we launched, there was a lot of people saying, well, no one will ever pay for podcasting. And what are you doing? And some people are still saying that, but I think we're proving them wrong. And the people are willing to pay for podcasting. It's a great content that listeners invest an enormous amount of time in enjoying. And that also, in my world, equals potentially a willingness to pay instead of it being advertising based solely. So we are growing, as you said. And I think that is the core proof of there's definitely an appetite from the listener side to have more content, friction-free content, and enjoy it in an app that's tailored solely for podcasting and for spoken word audio.
So what's the average price of the subscription that you're seeing at the moment? And has that gone up over the years that you've been doing it?
We haven't raised prices. It varies a little bit market to market, but in average, I think it's around €5. Our listeners, they pay on a monthly basis. It varies a little bit depending on the market and so forth. The interesting thing is, as you mentioned, we also just raised. So a lot of investors have obviously asked the question, what will recession do to your business? And so far, we see the lowest churn we've ever had. So the users that decide to quit the subscription and leave is the lowest we've seen. And we also have some of the best CAC levels, which is how much does it cost to acquire a new user for us. So we don't have any things pointed toward that recession will hit us. Let's see what the future brings. But I think having the exclusive content we have and having listeners spend around 20 hours on our service per month just creates so much value that listeners keep on paying for it.
So 2 questions that I'd like to lead into. One is, you support the local content creator. How does that happen? Do they come to you? Do you go to them? How do you decide on what you're going to go and in what category? Is it thriller? Is it, news? So I'm trying to understand what your content base is really.
Yeah, so every week we publish around 300 new episodes on Podimo across the markets we're in. And it varies from market what kind of genre we focus in on. But a lot of entertainment, obviously, but also true crime, documentary. We also have invested quite a bit into fiction content, for example. There's a lot of content types that we spend an enormous amount of time on if you turn on the TV or open a book, where you haven't found that in podcasting or in short form audio, which we're big believers will also have their place in a short form world. So, but typically a lot of entertaining content, but also content that you can learn from. So content you can relax to and have a laugh to, but also content that will make you question and self-development and so forth. Typically we license content where we pay for it upfront. So if you, for example, have fiction, then it might take 6 months to write a fiction show. So we then fund those authors or journalists in those 6 months and onwards after launch to create content. So a lot of the content we have is licensed content where we pay a fixed fee, which makes it affordable for people to also spend time on creating the content. And then we also have some creators that already have a show and they have recording capabilities and so forth, editing capabilities. So they simply just upload the content to our platform and then they monetize through subscription through our platform. So we also have the rev shares, we call it, where you get 50% of the revenue generated depending on how much you listen to. But it's a user-centric revenue share, we call it. So that means if a user only listens to your show, then you get all of that user's revenue. It's not like in the music industry where Beyonce, she takes the bulk of the money, even though you might not even be listening to her as a subscriber, right?
Now, you've grown out of Denmark into multiple other markets. You've expanded out into the Netherlands recently. What other markets you're in and what markets are you planning to go in? One of the things I noticed on the investment acquisition was the market expansion was one of the key requirements. So what markets might you be going into next?
I think that what we see is that every time we launch a market, there's definitely an appetite for subscription, both from creators, but also from the listener side, right? So we really feel that there's a global potential for a service like Podimo. And that also means that we are aggressive in our rollout strategy. So far, we're in Denmark. We launched a month ago in Finland. We're in Norway. We're in Germany, we're in Spain, we're in the Netherlands, as you mentioned as well, and also in Mexico. So I think the next 12 months, we have 4 or 5 market launches. Most of them are European, also some of the bigger European markets. So I don't think we announce exactly which markets for competitive reasons. But I guess if I say European and some of the bigger ones, then there's not a lot to choose between left in terms of where we're not already in.
May I just say we look forward to you in France. Now, apart from podcasting, one of the things you've done is gone into audiobooks as well. Spotify last week announced that they've gone into audiobooks. First of all, given that you've been doing it for a while, how do you find users? Are they 50-50, audiobooks and podcasts? Is it 80-20? What's the split in terms of listening? Because you've got good data and experience in doing this.
Yeah, I think audiobooks is a core part of our offering, but it's definitely the majority of listening and value is through podcasting and short form. That's our focus and where we're born and where we really can make a difference. I think that the interesting thing with audiobooks is that it can drive more engagement. So audiobooks can serve a different need for the user, that if you also unlock that and start listening to audiobooks, then you get even more value out of Podimo and you stay for longer, which is great for everybody in the ecosystem. I think some of the interesting things we're rolling out over the next couple of months is our new recommendation engine geared towards audiobooks, so that, for example, if I listen to a podcast history show about some historical event, then I'm also recommended books that dive deeper into that topic and vice versa, right? So I think both for podcasters, but also for authors, that we can begin to cross-promote the two formats to really help the users and thereby help the creators to unfold their content and get out to new audiences. It makes a lot of difference, right? So that's some of the things that we believe will add significant value, not just having the content, but actually having the content recommended in the right way at the right point of time to really unfold it in a new way.
Now, are the audiobooks part of the standard subscription, or are they like Spotify, an additional payment beyond the subscription?
Yeah, so we have 10 hours of audiobook listening in our standard subscription. And then if you want to go unlimited, then you pay an extra monthly fee to have unlimited listening. So we don't have a la carte solution like Spotify have launched recently. It's an all you can eat, but the lower tier is only 10 hours and then the high tier is unlimited.
Now, there's two other trends going on in the market. Apparently, YouTube seemed to be knocking on the door of podcasting, although what I've seen so far is pretty poor. Would you consider moving into a video-based content offering for Podimo?
It's an interesting question. We actually have been testing it the last 4 or 5 months, where we've done professionally produced video versions of some of our shows, but we've done it on our platform so that you can, as a listener, you can enjoy the video version of the show and go full screen and watch it. I think the power of the medium of audio is that you can integrate it while you're doing something else, right? Well, for a run and so forth. So I'm a big believer in audio, and there's so much growth still to be grabbed in that, but I do also believe that video can add a different layer to the experience if it's used in the right way. I think it depends very much on the format and the creator and so forth. But for some shows, they get stronger by also having video and creates an even more unique experience from a listener perspective or viewer perspective. So it is actually something that we already are testing, but numbers so far are pretty good in terms of users watching video and streaming the video and so forth. So I think that video will be part of the core experience, but it's not going to take over. I think it will be an add-on, an extension, rather than something that will take over in the future. But definitely, I do believe in video, and I think it just helps extend the full experience and potential of a creator by also having that as an option.
I agree. Now, one of the other things I read in the investment doc was you're looking at technology and product as a part of the investment. What's the technology that you might be looking at? For example, I'm very keen on value for value cryptocurrencies, Satoshis as a payment system. Are you looking at that so you're not paying gateway fees to, I don't know, PayPal, Stripe or whoever? Or what's the tech that you might be looking at?
We're not looking, to be honest, much in that direction yet. I won't rule out that there's something we're also, and it will be a big part of the future. But for us, it's more geared towards how can we help creators to get even closer to their users. I think the unique thing is that we own the demand, so to say, that users, they browse around in an app that we've built. And if we can build more ways for creators and users to get closer to each other, that makes a ton of sense. And then we invest a lot into the whole discovery and unfolding. One of the things that we're seeing really good traction on now is actually audio recommendations. So instead of just having a normal text recommendation or a pop-up in the app, then you actually get a personalized audio recommendation as part of the experience, which has really high engagement and high hit rates for users that find that valuable and listen to more content because of that. So I think there will be a lot of more investments going towards really discovery and unfolding content, but also figuring out if we can add a different layer to the content. Can we add a deeper layer than just the flat audio experience, because we benefit from actually owning the tech side of and the product side of the experience as well?
Yeah, you can add into anything you wish to make the experience better. Where's the exit, Morten? Where's the exit? Are you IPOing? Are you being acquired? When you form a company, one of those things that you look at is, 5 years down the track or whatever the time frame may be. Do you have anything in mind? You may have it, you may not want to tell us, but in your own mind and with your co-founders, have you thought about what you might want to do?
Yeah, but I think I've tried founding a couple of companies prior to Podimo, and why Podimo is so different and why it's something that I want to take all the way is that it's a great group of people and the team is amazing to work with, but we're also creating content that makes a difference, right? We're creating content and we help fund creators to be able to invest the time in creating great content that hits the front pages of newspapers, content that you can learn from, that can make you ask questions. And personally, if you see what happens in terms of the growing amount of people that have social media as their main news source, right? I think that we can really make a difference in terms of helping creators and users to enjoy content that they can laugh to, but also content that will make them ask the right questions, and which I think is very powerful and very meaningful. So in terms of exit, I focus very much on building a global company and a company that is making a difference, not just for creators, but for users and for society. And then I'm sure there will be plenty of exit paths in the future, preferably IPO, where we can stand on our own legs with what we would be what we look towards. But for now, we're focusing on building an amazing company, and then we'll take the exit question once we get way further down the line.
Morten Strunger from Podimo. Fascinating stuff. I think there's a lot of talk in the US about subscription-based shows. And for me, the best thing that the US could do is to actually have a look at how other countries are doing it. And that goes for quite a lot of things, but particularly around, podcasting and a subscription-based show. So really, really interesting. So thank you for that.
They are certainly expanding into 4 more European countries. He couldn't obviously tell me which ones, but we can certainly guess. They are going great guns, and they're holding their nerve by being subscription-based only, which is quite interesting. The other one that I thought was interesting is because they do audiobooks, they've worked out what the average user in terms of audiobooks is going to listen to in a month. And unlike Spotify, they're not charging individually extra on top of their base subscription for additional audiobooks. They include that within the pricing.
No, it's a really interesting company, and it's been, going for a number of years. It would be interesting to see how they end up growing. And I think, fascinating that they've been focusing very much on non-English speaking countries. And I wonder whether the 4 that they are expanding into, I wonder whether one of those is likely to be the UK or Ireland, because that, I think they will find things are a little bit different in those countries.
I would probably push back on that one, James. I wouldn't want to, if I was Morten, go into an English-speaking language market, because I don't think that's their differentiator. I think they would then be coming up against many competitors. I think they're going to markets where they have fewer competitors and they can gain a market share faster. That may be just my interpretation, but so I will see of what the 4 countries.
No, I think you're right.
I'm guessing it won't be the UK and Ireland. Now, another company you wrote about was called Third Ear Studio. They are in Sweden, and they make subscription-based content as well. They claim to have more than 20,000 subscribers paying $5 per month. And they've recently got a $1 million worth of investment. This sounds very much like Podimo. Have you spoken or heard of Third Ear at all, James?
I was last in Sweden in 2019, and I don't remember them being a big thing back then. But it does look as if, that's the sort of thing that Podimo would be interested in, or indeed PodX, which is the other strange old company coming out of the Scandic countries, which is a company which is investing in podcast IP and going out and reselling that, which seems to have some very big backers, as well. So who knows? Maybe that's maybe they are setting themselves up, Third Ear Studio, as an acquisition target.
Good luck to them. That's all I'll say. Good luck to them. Now. A couple of weeks ago, or last week even, we talked about this new platform that John Spurlock has been developing called OP3, the Open Podcast Prefix Project. And it's, again, looking at prefix analytics, which seems to be the hot topic this week. It's committed to open data and listener privacy. I don't really understand this space, I have to say. You explained it very well last week. But I thought I'll go to the horse's mouth. Sorry, John, I shouldn't call you a horse. And I thought I'd ask John more about it.
Basically, it is a prefix service, just like other podcast services that track downloads. This is something that has been pretty standard for large shows, at least over the last few years. Independent verification of downloads. And that can be useful for business arrangements if a show wants to be acquired or sell advertising or just compared to other shows in an independent way. A third party to verify these sorts of things is actually very useful. The podcast hosting companies do a really good job. Most of them do a really good job of stats themselves, but comparing host to host, comparing shows between hosts can be difficult because even if they have the same certification, a lot of these certifications are not as exact as you would think. So they leave a lot up to the implementation. So even comparing shows across hosts is difficult. So what I did with OP3, which is the new service that I've been working on, is it basically is the same idea as those services, except that it is open in the sense that the data that comes out the other end, the safe listener data that's stored, is actually available to anyone to innovate on top of. And the reason that that's interesting, it's not some sort of altruistic, like let's just make everything open. I think if you look at where podcasting is now and look at what hosting companies provide now, they have a lot of features that they'd love to get to. And they all have stats now that they kind of offer. This used to be something that hosting companies could use as a differentiation. You could say, hey, I have stats. This makes my hosting company better than the other. But now it's almost, I hate the term, but it's table stakes. It's something that like you expect any host to have. And so if all hosts are doing stats calculations, and it's not trivial, it's actually quite difficult to do this well. They're all doing it, dozens of hosts. It's sort of a shame. And so the idea is, what if we had a clearinghouse where we could, kind of specialize the concern and make stats, a common building block that any host, new host, could build on top of and really trust the numbers that are coming out of it because it's coming from an independent place. Well, that's the idea anyways. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of the idea. The reason I'm doing it myself is that, again, it's not corporate backed. I'm not getting paid for this necessarily. I am asking for sponsorships, but it's basically something where the quality of the data is what's most important. So I do some posts about new episodes. So podcasts that release new episodes and where they're coming from and what they're using, that sort of thing. That's one source of data, but it'd be interesting to know how popular some of these shows are, where the downloads are. That's kind of a whole nother dimension on it. So I'm coming more from the data aspect. I love data. I love crunching the numbers. And I think data is actually really interesting. If you are a podcaster, you can glean all sorts of interesting statistics based off your show and potentially use it to tailor your content and, again, do business arrangements, that sort of thing. Also, as a listener, I'm very committed to privacy. So there's many ways that these services can go off the rails and, be incentivized to mix the incoming data with other databases and things like that. But as a listener, I think for basic download information, for basic summary information, you don't need to do that. You don't need to know, hey, one of your listeners was sad on Thursday. That's not something that is needed to know kind of high level stats about the show. So this service is something that it basically, there's this concept of minimization in GDPR where it's like you only capture the attributes that you need. And sort of that's the model that we're using for this service here. We actually throw away most of the requests that we get at the moment. And we have a few privacy policies up there now, but the intention is to have enough documentation that people can actually see what we're doing with the data.
So where do you get your data from? Is that from the Open RSS community, or are you reliant on hosts to implement it first so that you can access their content?
So this prefix is something that the podcaster has to opt into. So they have to choose, hey, I want to enable this for my show. And the reason they're called prefixes is because it's basically a little HTTP, my domain prefix that you put in front of all of your episodes. So when the app goes to download the episode, they hit my server first, and then I redirect them over to the real content. And again, there's services like Podtrack and Chartable that do this already. There's some shows that have 4 or 5 of these prefixes. So when you download, you're actually ping-ponging through 5 or 6 different servers. But it basically gives you an idea of where the requests are coming from. Each one of those services gets the same information. So they can be independently verified. So basically what I'm asking with this service is, even though it's very early, it is very stable. So it's kind of something that is ready to go from a data ingestion point of view. So I'm really looking to get sample shows that are kind of larger than your average show. We do have one whale of a show on there right now, and that was great for testing out the infrastructure. But if you have a large show and think something like this is important to kind of the future of podcasting, get in touch, because I would love to have larger shows actually send some of their data in. It just helps prove out the entire thing. Again, we can't offer much right now. The roadmap is on our site, but right now we make the data available over a kind of a basic API. But in the future, we're going to do, the standard download calculations. We're going to filter out duplicates and bad traffic and that sort of thing. And then eventually provide charts and widgets so that people can do comparisons and that sort of thing.
Great. So James has already implemented it at Pod News, and I know Justin's already implemented at Transistor.fm. Has anyone else that you know of implemented it already?
As far as hosting companies go, I've had some conversations. Some hosting companies actually don't do integrations as nice as the Transistor one, where it's just a checkbox. The process, even for the existing prefixes for a lot of these hosting companies, is just to email them. And then they will kind of verify that it works on the back end. And so right now, pretty much any host you can email and they will do that for you. I know I've seen some Megaphone shows come through. I've seen some, like you said, Transistor and some Buzzsprout shows come through. But I know we are working with the shows that do provide those checkboxes to make sure OP3 is one of the options.
Now, one of the things that you announced this week was something I just didn't understand at all, so I'm glad you're here to explain it. The Open Podcast Analytics Prefix Service, aka OP3, has now added trailing wildcards to its API, and I was like, whoa, I'm way above my paycheck here now. I have no idea what you're talking about. So please, can you explain that in English?
Yeah, so it's a very technical thing. It's basically something to enhance the current API. The current API, you can say, what are the stats for a particular episode URL? So you can give it one link to your episode and we'll give you the requests that we see for that. Some shows vary those URLs. So depending on who hits the RSS feed, that URL could actually change a bit. Maybe they have additional query parameters. So it's basically just a way to say, give me information on several URLs with the same prefix. So they don't start with the same characters. Does that make sense? So that way you can kind of see the requests at a larger level. Now, this is a stopgap. The next thing on my plate, actually, if you look at the roadmap, is to do this on the back end automatically, roll up to shows and episodes. We want to be able to say, hey, we received a request. Identify the show, the public show, and the public episode. That's job one, because we can't do any show-based, shows or download summaries without it. So that release last week was just kind of a stopgap.
Okay. I know that Dave Jones from the Podcast Index is working on some visualization tools based around what you've done, and that there's a open GitHub available, and I'll put it in the show notes, where people can see other apps that are beginning to use the data as well. I know James is very heavily involved in that. Now, one of the things we talked about briefly off air before we came on was the Ashley Carman breaking news this week about iHeartRadio paying for ads within games, which inflated their numbers. Is there anything that could have been done using OP3, for example, that would have helped mitigate this?
Yeah, this is an interesting story. I think I saw a lot of hot takes on this yesterday, but I think it's actually a little more complex than a lot of the stories that I've seen so far. Anyone that's been involved in digital marketing knows that marketing is paying for traffic. It's paying to get your product in front of someone else. And a lot of times these days, that's in a digital form. And so there's all sorts of clever and crazy ways of getting your podcast in front of viewers that wouldn't have otherwise seen it. And so that's one way to look at apps like this, is that it's a venue. It's kind of like a banner ad, but for podcasts, you have to listen to the content a bit. So it's a way to have people try the ad. And in something like this, I would be interested in retention. So of the 1,000 listeners that are forced to listen to 20 seconds of a podcast, I don't think the retention is zero. I'm sure some of those folks subscribe to the show. It's probably much lower than your standard placement anywhere else. And so that's where I think the distinction should be made. I think, especially for advertising, it's probably worth paying for some of that traffic, but you almost want to spend a different CPM on it. So I think for a service like OP3, ideally we'd be able to identify this so-called rewarded traffic, which I love that term, rewarded. It's something that we should be able to identify and include or not in the download calculations. So basically be transparent about where the traffic is coming from. So for a given show, you could be able to say, give me the standard download calculation, and we'll make a decision on whether or not to include these. But then you'll be able to further slice and dice it and say, okay, now include rewarded traffic, or how much of the show came from this rewarded traffic? How much of it came through VPNs? One of the things that's sort of similar to the automated problem is a VPN problem. Many more people are using VPNs these days. And what that means is that some of the filters that the industry has been using to filter out some of these downloads are now partially made up of legitimate traffic. So it's not as simple as just throwing out all IPs that are coming from Amazon Web Services. There's a lot of these VPNs that are hosted on Amazon Web Services. So I think OP3, what we're going to do is basically tag traffic so that you could say, hey, this came from a cloud service. This came from, this marketing venue, or this came from a legitimate app. And then people can make their own decision, and we'll make a single decision by default, but you should be able to slice and dice the data as these things change. It's a very dynamic ecosystem.
I mean, I guess when I look at what Ashley wrote about, and you're looking at something that is highly desirable, the gamer wants to get to the game, so they're prepared to wait out the 20 seconds that they have to within the ad. You can't skip it. I don't know if it's a good thing having this type of content for marketing purposes to just inflate your numbers. What do you think?
Again, I do think it does inflate the numbers to an extent. Like, let's say you did an ad deal prior to using one of these services and you agreed on a certain CPM. Then once the ad deal was reached, then you start using one of these services. That's problematic because now the traffic that you're getting is kind of a different flavor than it was before. Mm-hmm. This is just my opinion. Yeah. So you would have negotiated a different rate had you knew that this is where most of your listeners are coming from. And so the fact that it's not disclosed maybe is something that's problematic. But if you're a listener, if you're a podcaster that has no ads in your content, you just want to get in front of people, and this is a nice, easy way to do it while you're sleeping, I think that's fine. I don't think it's just like any other digital marketing channel. If you're an app, we've made apps for 20 years. If you're an app right now, you have to pay the app stores quite a bit to get even your search results in front of your users. So this is something that's not kind of new to any sort of digital marketing sphere. And I know even the new Podcast 2.0 apps, there's a few apps that will pay listeners, right? They'll pay you to listen to podcasts. It's sort of similar. It's something maybe they would not have done had they not had just a little bit of an incentive. And again, I don't think it's necessarily high quality traffic. I think that for every 1,000 listener, you're going to get maybe one that signs up. But to call it cheating, I think is a little bit simplistic. But it's something I'm really glad that it's out there because I don't think a lot of people knew about it. And only us that like work in the internet infrastructure world kind of knew about it. But I think it's nice to have it transparent. And that's something OP3 will do, is it will show you, hey, this is, kind of categorized traffic.
Will the other, I suppose I call it the dirty secret of podcasting, which is downloads with ads baked into them, which then are never heard, but they are paid for. So the third ad within a podcast that isn't heard because of people only listen to 60% of the podcast before they fade off. But that ad has had to be paid for because it's downloaded. Should we remove the whole download model now? Because isn't it just a legacy of, I don't know, I suppose 3G and poor data communication lines? I mean, you and I wouldn't download our Netflix film before we watched it today because of good communication networks. Can't we just stream podcasts and therefore bypass this whole download issue?
That's a big question. I think even me, so I have fiber at home, I pre-download, and there's certain reasons for that. If I'm going out for a walk or if I'm leaving the house, it is nice. There's some sense that podcasts are short enough that they download sort of transparently in the background. It's nice to have that content, no matter if the power goes out, whatever happens. Mm-hmm. So just from even Spotify does this. So they will, for the past years, they will actually download instead of stream a lot of their content. Now, things like YouTube and Netflix don't, but there's also a technical aspect on the back end. So there's dozens of these podcast hosts now, and they're all built around the concept of downloading. There's a lot more communication, more tight communication that's necessary between listener and backend if you want to stream. And so getting all of them to upgrade to another standard, it's not impossible, but from what I can tell, it would be a very difficult challenge. I think honestly, there's very little difference. If you look at the kind of back, a lot of the apps basically download on demand, which is, I don't know, you could call it streaming already. The only thing you lose is the delivery aspect. So the delivery, like you said, if an ad was actually listened to. But even if it's straight, I think the listener app only knows that aspect of things. So until we get some sort of standard that listener apps provide that data back, which I'm not holding my breath for, but it would be nice. You're going to basically always just have to factor it in. So I've had a bunch of conversations after launching this OP3 service, and it seems like that most advertisers are fine with the download model because they know, I mean, they're aware of this as well. And they know that a certain percentage, even though they say it was delivered, are not actually listened to. And they just factor that into their model. And they apply some sort of blanket percent. And that seems to be fine. Obviously, they probably like it even more micromanaged and controlled. That seems fine for now, but we'll see how it goes forward in the future. I think given how distributed podcast hosts are, podcast listening apps are, it's going to be very difficult to organize around a single standard. I know NPR tried to do something exactly like this several years ago now, and they just had a real uphill battle, and even their shows did not use it. But it's a very difficult problem.
Yeah, James says the same thing. He says that, the industry's factored in for downloads not being listened to, or for example, Apple will continue to download podcasts that are not even heard, let alone started. And yet those numbers are factored into the download model. John, thank you so much for building OP3 and now explaining what OP3 is and delivering it as an open standard across the industry. Can you tell everyone, if they want to find out more about it, where best to go and look?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just op3.dev, so like development. And really, I'm looking for two things. Like I said before, large shows would be great to get on board early. And then also sponsorship, because this is not a free service to host. So there's a lot of data. This needs to be up 100% of the time. It needs to serve requests coming from all over the world quickly. So there will be ongoing operational costs. So I do have a sponsorship there. If you click on the sponsor link for people to basically indicate that they love the idea of an auditable, open service like this. And it's just a way to indicate that it's worth spending time on. So I'd encourage everyone to take a look at that. And then also, if you're a podcaster, to add the prefix. It's free. You don't need to sign up for anything. It's fairly simple. If your host supports it, or even if they don't, you can email, like I said before. So really excited to get this out there and have hosts be able to worry about other features other than stats going forward.
John Spurlock from the Open Podcast Prefix Project, and indeed many other things as well. He's been doing some really fascinating data, some really, really good work. So great to hear him on the Podland podcast again. And we should be very clear, they are not producing analytics yet. They are producing logs of the amount of redirects that they are getting. That is not a download, even though some people are busy working on tools that show this data in a little bit of a better way. None of these are actually pointing to what downloads are yet, because they haven't been filtered properly yet. But it'll be really interesting once that happens.
I'll put a link in the show notes to the tools that are currently available. Now, James, one of the things that John talked about was exactly what you said a few minutes ago, that unless we fix this problem in the open ecosystem, Spotify has the competitive advantage by having the closed system, knowing everything that's going on. He did think that OP3 could be a way of overcoming that problem, but I hadn't heard of RAD until you mentioned it. Is OP3 basically a new version of RAD then?
No. So, I mean, OP3 is basically just an open way of looking at podcast download data and being able to actually see that in public. And I think that the exciting thing here is that it does allow anyone who wants to be able to have a look at data from a wide variety of different podcast publishers. And so that's going to be useful for academics that want to know, Spotify or Apple, who's bigger. It'll also be useful for a variety of other things as well. In fact, one of the pieces of work that John is working on at the moment is what other data he actually has from a particular download. What can you then pull out of that? So one example, for example, might be when someone downloads a podcast. And you're probably thinking, well, I already know all of that information. Well, actually, yes, you do, but you probably don't, because actually what you know is the time that somebody downloaded a podcast according to server logs. But the time here, for example, is 4:46 in the afternoon. The time with you is rather a lot earlier in the morning. And so actually knowing somebody's local time, for example, that's not a privacy invading thing at all, but it does enable me to understand what time you are listening to a podcast. And that is quite useful. So, a bunch of this additional data will be really helpful. But this isn't a replacement to any player stats. This is still very much based on the download, on the file request. But the data that we get out of it is, I think, going to be really, really useful.
We'll keep an eye on the Open Podcast Prefix project. And if you want to keep an eye on it too, you can go to op3.dev, and John's kindly put a roadmap of what's going to come down the road for him. Now, moving on. It seems there's a lot of other companies in the industry who are looking at providing different real-time and measurement tools. One of those is the ad tech company Gumball, which has announced a new product called Gumshoe. It's a real-time tool to measure ad impressions from host-read podcast ads. Tell me more, James.
Yeah, so obviously podcast advertising normally is a 30-second spot. You've probably already heard one thanks to Buzzsprout ads. It's a pre-recorded thing that goes into a podcast, and that's all fine, and they're quite easy to measure. When you have a look at host-read podcast ads, me just wittering on about Squadcast and how good it is and how good version 5 is and blah, 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 that is much harder to spot because you can't measure that in terms of where the ad ran. You have to do rather a lot more hard work, and that's what Gumshoe is all about. So it's there to measure those ad impressions from host-read podcast ads. It allows all kinds of things, including booking tools and audience demographics and everything else. And it's something that actually hasn't really existed in this industry before now, is a set of tools that are having a listen to individual shows to work out where the host-read ads are. So it's a very clever piece of tech, and it's good to see Gumball, Gumshoe, HeadGum working on that particular tool.
Other companies are doing other interesting things. Podcast analytics platform Magellan AI has announced a new attribution tool. The service enables insights into campaign performance, pacing, and success within the Magellan AI dashboard. Again, I am totally blinded by this area. This is probably Brian and your area more than mine. But what is this one about, James?
I was impressed that you called them Magellan. I called them Magellan for the first year, and it turns out that I'm too British. And that they really are called Magellan AI. They're also sponsoring Pod News this month as the title sponsor, so thank you to them for that. So this is an attribution tool. So it essentially allows you to know that the person who heard that ad then went on and bought that product or visited that website. So that's something that Podsites offers, that Chartable have offered, that Magellan AI are also now offering as well. And there's a bunch of additional data that they've got in there too. So that's a good piece of additional tech. Again, helping advertisers understand what people are having a listen to in particular podcasts.
Another company that I want you to help me try and understand, who've announced something new, is Podscribe. They've announced a third-party impression and verification tool. The prefix service offers placement verification, automation, and brand safety. Okay, unpack that for me, James, because that doesn't mean anything to me at all.
Well, so impression verification is basically instead of just trusting that somebody actually put the ad where they said that they put the ad, that's fine. But actually, trust, as we've seen from earlier stories, trust isn't always a good plan. So instead, Podscribe has launched a tool which allows that ad impression to be measured automatically. What it also allows you to do is it allows you to know how many of those shows have actually run with your ads in there. And also the brand safety stuff is something that advertisers are very, very keen in looking into. So making sure that they are not being associated with the types of content that an advertiser doesn't necessarily want to be involved with. If you're a kids brand, then you don't want to be advertising next to saucy adult content and so on and so forth. So so there's a bunch of those tools existing, and Podscribe is certainly one of those. And it's again another impression and verification tool. And I think with all three of these, you are seeing that there's a real requirement in the industry at the moment for just getting a bit more reliable figures out there in terms of numbers.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. Now, the last one I wanted to talk to you about in this section was a podcast information tool called Podkite that has released a number of updates to its dashboard to access Apple and Spotify ratings, an improved chart ranking panel, and integrated prefix tools. The company claims the fastest prefix redirect in the industry, and I don't even know if that's a good claim, but and why that would be a good claim. So tell me why, why or what is Podkite?
They've got a bunch of things. One of the things that they're doing is pulling out Apple and Spotify ratings, which is a lovely thing. There are a bunch of companies doing that. Chartable, of course, also does that sort of thing, and that's fine. This fastest prefix redirect, I love the way that the research has actually been shown on their website, which is, we don't even know whether this is actually very important, and it probably isn't particularly important. And then Jalal, who wrote the post, says, it matters a little bit in my opinion, but it may not matter that much. The prefix speed, which is only really important if you are pressing that play button and your podcast app is going off and downloading the audio instantly. Podkite is much, much faster than the other three that they checked. Now, he hasn't checked OP3 yet. It'll be interesting to see if he does check OP3. My suspicion is that OP3 will be just as fast as Podkite because of the way that OP3 is built. But anyway, we'll I'm sure, find out about that. But it's not that important, but speed is important for other things online, and speed certainly is one of the reasons that the Pod News website looks as it does. It's supposed to be very, very quick for you to download and use, and so that's a good thing. The one interesting thing that Podkite did come up with, though, is because they're pulling Apple and Spotify ratings depending on which country the audience is in, they've been able to actually point out that that there's quite a lot of differences between individual countries in terms of the types of ratings scores that they give. So almost a third of all ratings given in Afghanistan, for example, are 1 star, almost a third. Brunei is second most grumpy, if you like, but they only have 14%. So there's a big difference. And again, it comes down to culture. It comes down to that difference between, if you're a Brit, you're going to give an Uber driver a slightly different star rating than you would if you're an American.
James, no. Brits are really grumpy at the moment. We'll give 1-star ratings to everything at the moment.
I mean, Brits are extraordinarily grumpy, but actually Brits are much less likely to give a 5-star, in my opinion, than a typical American is, because I think Brits firstly want to be a little bit more honest in terms of their rating, but also we've grown up with a different set of cultural norms than somebody in the US. I thought it was interesting looking at this the other way, though. Places places that give out the most 5-star ratings. Costa Rica is, I think, number 1. Guatemala is number 2. Slovenia, the only country with love in its name, is also there as well. So there's a nice thing.
Well, when I read the company claims the fastest prefix redirect in the industry, all I could think of was Benny Hill and Ernie, and he drives the fastest milk cart in the West, because it was about as useful.
And he drove the fastest milk cart in the West.
Yes, thanks for that.
Cultural reference. Now, moving on to some tech stuff. If you use a PowerPress from Blueberry, then good news, you can actually start to use Podping. It looks like they've integrated it into the Blueberry dashboard. And that is about increasing the speed of your podcast being delivered to its app client. So again, James, tell me more. What's Todd done?
Yes, so this is if you use PowerPress. Blueberry is coming, but PowerPress is already done. When you publish a podcast episode, it will automatically go onto Podping, and that means that any new podcast app will almost instantly know that you have made a new episode, which is a pretty cool thing. If you host with Blueberry, then that will come relatively soon. And I think Todd is very keen on this. He's been talking about wanting to attract the 3%, as he calls them, those people that are interested in the new podcasting 2.0 tags and the namespace and everything else. And he sees there being a real opportunity in being a company that supports all of those.
On the new media show this week, James, in fact, they have Dave Jones as a guest. So Todd and Rob are talking a lot about Podcast Index 2.0 and all of this stuff. So if you want to catch up on
have you listened to that all the way through yet?
No, should I have done before I mentioned it?
I've listened to half of it so far, and
right.
And I very much enjoyed the opening, which was Todd saying, "So the Pod Sage himself, Dave Jones, we must find out how you got the name Pod Sage." And so I'm very much hoping that that the story of how Dave Jones got the name Podsage comes up in the new media show. It is of course your invention, that.
Well, I think our invention. I think we came up with it.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think he likes it, so I think that's
he uses it.
All right. So yes, I've been enjoying that. I have for the new media show, I have switched back to the Pocket Casts app, if only because I then have it on, getting rid of all of the gaps and listening to that show 1.4 times speed, and it's a super great listen when you do that. It's just like bang, bang, bang. You know, there's so much information in there, very, very fast. So that's certainly a good listen. Let's move on. Adthos has added more than 75 new data API points. This is really cool. If you are making dynamic ads, then you might want to make a dynamic ad if, for example, Liverpool ended up losing a match, just so that
That's
you
not
can
gonna
crow
happen, though,
over
James.
the poor people who have to support Liverpool. So Adthos would allow you to end up doing that. It fuels a lot of the dynamic ad manufacturing things, and you can obviously do it on sport, you can do it on stocks, on news, on all kinds of things. So actually, if you were clever and you were, say, British Airways, then you could check with Adthos when you were producing an ad just to see that there wasn't an air crash in the news at the moment. And if there was an air crash, then automatically stop all of your ads from running. You could do all of that kind of stuff with there. So that's a pretty cool and clever thing.
Yeah.
That company has built.
Yeah, in just very minor news, but Audacity 3.2 is now out, adding real-time effects and support for Apple Silicon.
Yes, so I understand Audacity is getting better and better as an audio editor. Yes, if you want your details to be passed back to Russia, then go ahead and use it. But don't forget that it does that. It's a free download wherever a Google search for Audacity will will end up finding it. There's also a new transcription tool from OpenAI. They do a lot of artificial intelligence stuff. It's called Whisper. It's supposed to be super, super good. It is free. It is available as an open download. Anybody can download it and stick it onto their own computers and stuff. Apparently, it's quite hungry in terms of processor power, and it's quite slow, but nevertheless does the job really well, apparently. Some people are calling it the Holy Grail of transcription. I don't know whether that means that Monty Python can't find it, or whether there's a very scary rabbit looking after it, or whatever it is. But anyway, Whisper is
I tell you what it is, James.
Pretty cool.
It'll know the difference between an African and Asian swallow. That's what it will know.
Yes. What is it, an African and Asian swallow in flight? Yes, the airspeed or whatever it is. Oh dear. It's turning to one of those parties. And YouTube has, this I think is very clever. YouTube has announced a music licensing service for YouTubers called Creator Music. Now you can go into this service if you're in the US only. You can go into this service and you can buy songs if you want to use songs in your YouTube creation, or you can even get hold of some songs as a revenue share. So you will share it with the revenue from your YouTube channel with the owner of that particular song, which is really cool. The caveat is that it's US only. Another caveat is that it's indie record labels only. So no, there won't be any licensing stuff from Warner Music, for example, or from Sony or whoever that might be. But nevertheless, it's pretty cool to see that YouTube has finally cracked the music licensing, thing. And again, makes you want to point at podcasting and try and understand why podcasting seems to be incapable of working out how podcast music licensing works. That said, of course, YouTube is a closed box, a closed garden, and they can do whatever they like in there.
Yes, there you go. Well, it's time for that moment, James. It's time for Boostergram Corner.
Now it's time for the Boostergram Corner. Boostergram Corner.
I don't know a thing about crypto.
Now, the first Boostergram we got was from Nathan G, 2000 sats, and he says, audiobooks on every platform have square covers, because we thought that Spotify was adding or changing the style of audiobook covers. But it seems, James, we were wrong. So put our hands up when we're wrong. I'd wager that's more to do with the legacy of selling them on CDs than podcasts. So thanks, Nathan. Yeah, I had a look at Audible, and yes, they are all square as well.
Oh, well, there you go. There you go. Well, thank you very much, Nathan. Nathan G, whoever you are, Nathan G. That's very kind of you. Dave Jones, the pod sage himself, has sent a couple of big rush boosts over to treble 1-2 sats. This was after I was expressing doubt about whether a specific music type for podcasts was a good plan. And I was basically saying I think it's just, a little bit worrying, and there'll be lots of copyright theft. And he says, I understand what you're saying, James, but I just hate the idea that technological progress within music distribution is held back purely by fear of litigation. I ought to be able to compose a song in my living room, he says, and then post it for distribution and earn from it. If an entrepreneur can't run a simple directory or platform of music podcasts without needing an army of 20 lawyers on retainer, then we have ceded ownership of not just rights, but of music itself to a cabal. I appreciate your pragmatism. It's just too depressing to think about. It certainly is. I completely agree that, yes, it's a very sad thing, but I'm also kind of there thinking, there may be trouble ahead.
Well, I came across via Olby, I came across a really interesting site called WAV Lake, W-A-V Lake, and that's a test alpha site where individual composers can upload their content, and you can then pay using Satoshis to actually choose the number of plays. And it works. It's really simple. It's integrated with Olby. And yeah, again, I can see that, outside of the big commercial companies that, you mentioned earlier, Warner Brothers and Sony, where you signed up, I can see individual composers wanting to put them up. Why not try a different form of, payment? Maybe people will be more interested in paying that way than they will the all-you-can-eat service like Spotify.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can certainly see that. Gene Bean has sent us a couple of 1,000 sat boosts. One of them saying that Podverse is working on streaming sat support. Yes, they are. They've been waiting for the player module that they use to be a little bit more capable of that sort of thing. So it'll be good to see when they end up launching that. And he also says, for what it's worth, a simple email earlier today to Buzzsprout got OP3 added for the podcast I'm starting up. Absolutely. If you are with Buzzsprout, then you don't have to fiddle around with anything at all. You can just send a quick email into support@buzzsprout.com, and they will add the OP3 prefix for your particular show. I've elected not to do that for this show so far, but we will see what happens in the future. And thanks to Tom Rossi from Buzzsprout for reaching out, because I think I may have mentioned it last week, offering whether or not we wanted to add it. So there you go. There's customer support for you.
Right, Adam Curry, the Podfather himself, has sent us 10,000 sats. Thanks, Adam. Lol, ads are fine, but value for value is for life, though. There you go.
Yes, exactly. Georg sent us 1,000 sats. Thank you, Georg. And Moritz from Albi, 2,000 sats, and he's asking about my airplane detector project. I've got all of the bits. The bits are all here. Listen, there they are. There are the bits for a little computer to sit somewhere and to tell me what that aeroplane is that's flying overhead. And he says, how big should the display be? I use a 3.5-inch Raspberry Pi LCD display with GPIO connection for my Lightning node that also runs on a Raspberry Pi, and I'm happy with it. Go podcasting. Yes, indeed. I'm busy looking at what type of display. I'm quite keen with an e-ink display, but who knows? So probably have a look at that. And yes, if you would like to send us a boost, then and you have no idea what we're talking about, then go and download Fountain. It's a very good podcast app. I'm an advisor at fountain.fm, and you can find out more information there, or play around with Albi as well. That will give you all kinds of useful things in there as well. Or indeed, just take a quick look at podnews.net/new podcast apps.
Now, finally, rounding up around Podland, what's going on around the rest of the world. France, we talked about them earlier. Podex, which is out of Sweden, has taken a majority stake in French podcast studio Nouvelle Écoute, whoever they are. I'm sure James will tell me in a minute. In the same release, Nouvelle Écoute announced that they've acquired Studio Minuit, which claims it's the second largest podcasting group in France. So there you go. There's my GCSE French pronunciation that butchered both those names. But James, tell me more. What have they done?
Bien sûr. Yes, I think you have given all of the information that I know as well.
Okay.
So Podex is that large IP company that I was talking about earlier. That's the one that is investing in all manner of different podcast companies. So yes, I'm fascinated to find out more about Podex. They've got a suspicious name. So it'd be good to learn a little bit more about that. Congratulations to Acast, who have done stuff in France. They have a new post-roll ad format, which is very good. It's called co-branded stories. Well, it isn't. It's something in French. And it's basically a post-roll, 2 to 3 minutes of bonus content promoting a particular brand, which is quite neat. What they've also announced today is they've announced research on podcast listening in Asia, looking at Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan. They're calling it the first podcast research in Asia, which is not factually correct. But nevertheless, some of the details that they've come across 90% of listeners finish all or most of a podcast episode, which is higher than some of the numbers that I've seen in other parts of the world. And 70% say that they are most focused when consuming podcasts rather than when they're consuming other media. So it's a thing to learn, but it's good to see Acast sharing data and information from some of their pieces of work. So thank you to them for that.
Moving on to Africa, the winners of the African Podcast and Voice Awards were announced in a virtual ceremony.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it was supported by podcast hosting company Captivate. I saw Danny Brown giving out some of the rather wonderful prizes. I gave away a prize as well. And the podcast of the year went to mantalk.ke by Eli Mwenda and Oscar Kwame Mbabu, which is actually a really interesting podcast. It is you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, men talking on a podcast. That's not really what anybody really wants. But it's actually talking about the problems around toxic masculinity and everything else. So it's a really good listen at mantalk.ke. So many congratulations to all of the winners of that particular award.
And finally, back round to the USA and back to Ashley Carman, who seems to be on a roll. She's reporting that CNN has let a number of employees in its podcasting unit go on Tuesday, the latest in a series of cuts at Warner Brothers Discovery Inc. So why are they cutting, James? Because, obviously we saw some cuts last week from other companies. Why are CNN doing it?
Well, CNN are desperately trying to cut as many costs as they can do. If you're a cable news channel, as CNN are, then most of your audience is over 60, and probably podcasts aren't seen as the thing that you should be focusing on. Arguably, they are the thing you should be focusing on because they need more younger audience. So it seems a very strange and backward step, but still, if that's what CNN want to end up doing, it just worries me. You have a look at CNN and the amount of cuts that they've done, the amount of good journalists that they've let go over the last month, and these are even more of those people. So sad to end up seeing. The Australian Podcast Awards has extended its deadline to Monday, which is a public holiday in most parts of Australia. Weirdly, it's the Queen's birthday, and it's still the Queen's birthday. As a day off. I know. But,
You won't have that when you're a republic.
Maybe it was too late to rename that particular holiday. I don't know. But anyway, yes, so you've got until Monday, October the 3rd to get your entries in for that. And then, of course, on October the 4th is Podcast Day 24, which is happening in both Sydney and in London. I will see you in Sydney. Pod News is actually sponsoring the drinks afterwards because, of course I would be, wouldn't I? So that should be fun. And it's also happening in London.
Now, if you missed out like me on Podcast Movement 2022, the sessions are now available on demand. So I'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, they are. And free if you went to Podcast Movement 2022. You can go back and watch those. That's included in your ticket. And you can buy a ticket if you did not do that. If you want to go and see Mark Maron's WTF, what's that for? In the UK, that's what it stands for, right? Then you can, October the 19th, in the Bloomsbury Theatre in London. David Baddiel will be the guest. So if you're a fan of WTF, then you can do that. And if you're a fan of podcast radio, then you can go to their New York conference event, which is happening on October the 19th. And they are also apparently going to be announcing a launch in the US as well. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but it might be quite fun.
That was one of the tweets that I picked up. If you want to know more about events or want to upload your own events, then I suggest you go to pod.events, which is part of Pod News, to find out more.
Indeed. What's happening for you this week in Podland, Sam?
I can't tell you, James, because you know, but I can't tell you.
Well, there we are. Cryptic as ever.
No, there's lots of stuff happening. There's lots of stuff going on. Certainly the heating's going on, but I'm watching the bill go up.
The heating's going on. Oh, you are made of money.
I'm not sure that I'll be putting the Christmas lights up this year. That might be a that might be too far for me, but the heating had to go on.
Well, at least you're not paying for the heating in American dollars, because goodness, imagine that. And for me, I mean, obviously, I've got my box of stuff to build into my aeroplane detection system. I'll be able to know where that helicopter was going. But also, what's available? Small plug is that title sponsorship for Pod News. Every single year, Pod News basically doesn't sell any until September, October, and then we make them all available for next year. You can only ever buy 1 month, because I don't want the same company being the title sponsor for more than that. But if you are interested in sponsoring Pod News for a month, doing what Magellan AI are doing this month, then you should. It's very good. And available all next year. Sales at podnews.net will connect you with Christy, and she will be able to help you further. And on that bombshell, that's it for this week. If you like this episode of Podland, tell others to visit, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back next week with another review and analysis of all things podcasting.
You'll also find all our previous shows and interviews on our website at podland.news. You can give us feedback using boostergrams, and if your podcast app doesn't support boosts, then grab a new one from podnews.net/new podcast apps.
Yes, if you'd like daily news, you should get Pod News. The newsletter's free, podnews.net. The podcast can be found in your podcast app and on your smart speaker, and all the stories we've discussed on Podland today are in the show notes. We use chapters and transcripts too.
Our music is from Studio Dragonfly, and we're hosted and sponsored by our very good friends Buzzsprout and Squadcast.
Keep listening. And I'm very aware that I say keep listening every single week, and then that is followed by the podcast ending. But that's just the way that it works. So keep listening to whatever's next.